Welcome! Today we're going to take a look at Prelude number 4, written by Heitor Villa-Lobos. Villa-Lobos is a Brazilian composer, a 20th century Brazilian composer, and this work was written about 1940. We're told it was a set of 5 preludes, although Villa-Lobos himself claimed that there were 6 that he wrote, and somehow the 6th one was lost. Toribio Santos also tells us that each of these preludes had a subtitle. The subtitle of this prelude is Homage to the Brazilian Indian. Santos says that this piece, more than any other piece, probably best describes the Brazilian forest. Describes the piece also as orchestral in its effect, and we'll explore that part as well. The set of 5 pieces were dedicated to Villa-Lobos' wife, and each of them has a distinctive character, but there are some similarities, some things they have in common. Number 1, there is a sense of simplicity to the melodies that Villa-Lobos uses, and many of these melodies are built on chords. In fact, sometimes melodic figures, even scale-like figures, such as in Prelude number 3, are actually arpeggiated chords across the fretboard. Because Villa-Lobos was a guitarist as well as a cellist and a pianist, we need to consider that the fingering that he recommends is done with the idea that the orchestral colors of the instrument best serve the expression of the music that he wrote. Some people take liberty with playing these pieces to such a degree that has been tampered with. So I encourage you, if you're just starting this piece and you see indications that the fingering is quite a bit different than what we're discussing, then you might want to make sure to take a look at the original and compare and make your own judgment. Okay, so what other characteristics about this piece that are interesting is the frequent meter change. Villa-Lobos does this in a number of the preludes. He has sections which are with varied meter, 4/4 and 3/4 in this case, and then a section which seems to be intact without any sense of meter at all, that has a sense of freeness to its structure. We see this in the 3rd prelude as well, where the beginning section is very strictly written out in varied meter, and the 2nd section is pretty much at liberty. So in this piece, we have something similar that takes place, although the tempo marking is not slow, it's fast. It's marked as animato. So let's take a look at the opening structure of the piece and see what we can learn. First off, notice that there's 1 sharp. So if this is tonal, which it is, we're either in the key of G or the key of E minor. And in this case, it is E minor. And you'll also notice that the piece has accents on different spots, and we have phrasing that is basically in the first 2 phrases, 2-bar phrases. So let's take a look at the beginning part of this piece. So the beginning melody then in the first measure is, at its simplest, just an E minor chord. It's got 2 notes around that final E that go, and it's rather dramatic, in fact. The dotted rhythm gives a sense of a power to that last note. It's recommended by Villa-Lobos that you play that all with the thumb, and I would say it probably should be very deep sounding. Imagine that you're playing the cello. Now, while this note is being played and held, a little bit of vibrato, not too much. And what I recommended in my performance, at least what I did, is I moved further back to create a different timbre. I would describe it as my intent that it is like thunder in the distance. Yeah. Whereas the melody is at the forefront and much more intense. The second subphrase after this is actually roughly a repetition, except for the very, very end, he gives 2 Ds, which seems to imply that maybe the second repetition, rather than being softer, is even louder. And then he moves from that to a different note. If I examine the scale that was used in that opening 2 subphrases, I would have 5 notes. That scale would sound something like this. Pentatonic. The next scale starts on F sharp and it goes down to A. A scale that uses that, if we went the full octave, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G, A, would not be an A minor scale, it'd be Dorian, it'd be a mode. So I think that was his intent, to use a mode instead of a pentatonic scale, and to end on the note A, and then he gives us this kind of a half diminished chord. Villa-Lobos loves half diminished chords, and in fact, if we take a look at some of the other pieces that he wrote in this series, we see those kind of chords. I should just take a brief pause here to emphasize that Villa-Lobos did have some favorites as composers. One was Bach. And the way that Bach develops melodies and sometimes uses chords to create melodic figures is something that Villa-Lobos makes use of himself. In this case, if you imagine that we were doing essentially, that's just an E chord. That's from Bach's Fourth Flute Suite. And in this case, when we compare that to what he's doing here, each of these scales have some similarity, but they all built around harmony as well as a varied scale choice. Pentatonic, and then this one here, Dorian. He sticks something new in here as well. It varies. We have a triplet. So with each of these phrases, it seems as if it's getting more intense. I would recommend that if you're starting the piece, even though he's marked every one of the beginning melodies forte, that you don't treat them all the same. That you imagine that each one is gaining greater intensity until the very final phrase. So let's try that on the second one here again. And then he goes to this scale, which if we look at the scale, it's going down, so it's a little hard to recognize it. But if we went up on the scale from F to C, instead of, as he's done, going down from C to F, we'd notice that it sounds kind of funny here on the B, because we've got a B natural. So this one has kind of a Lydian sound to it. And the chord that he uses against that is kind of diminished sound, yeah. Again, the next chord, he's going to change, and instead of giving us a long line, he alters just the ending part. chords a little bit louder so you can hear them. So we have this, and then this, and then the final chord. So on that final chord, we're back to where we started, E minor. And instead of having open strings, we're hearing the harmonics. In interpreting this piece of music, I'm making some recommendations that you can consider. One, that although the melodic idea, which is just essentially 2 bars in length for the first 4 bars, even though that melody is marked forte, I wouldn't play them all the same. I would see that in the overall section of the piece, that as we're moving down to the lower part of the register, it's gaining in greater intensity. And that's also complemented by the fact that the harmony itself, greater dissonance and tension. So we started off with just open strings, and then and the last one. Again, let's just listen to those chords again. First, measures 2 and 4. Measure 4. Measure 6. 8. 9. And the final one. Now the B section of this piece. So this piece has essentially 3 sections, although the last section is repeated once as harmonics, and then the second time reminiscent of the opening. So if we're giving it an overall structure, it would be an A, B, A, A. Yeah. So this next section is marked animato. It were recommended that not to use too much what we would call rubato on this, to try to keep it fairly even. I think that's a good idea, but my also concern is that the phrasing is one that makes sense. This is a section which oftentimes just sounds like a mad rush from the beginning to the end. Everything played very quickly as possible, and that's because it says animato, but beneath it, it says cantabile, as it did in the very beginning. Villa-Lobos frequently is asking the guitarists and musicians to make the melodies sing. And this is really an important part in interpreting this next section. So if we were to look at what part is singing, it's not arpeggios, it's not... It is the bass note that is the melodic line, and he's marked it with a stem down. And that is where he wrote the word cantabile. So if we listen to the first group of notes of this melody, and I play maybe in 1 position up here in 7th position, I would have... And that's the peak. At this point, he goes backwards and... And then here he moves to a chromatic line. So, what do we have? Well, we've got a sequence, a melody that has a particular shape. It goes from F sharp to A and then down. So it began with 3 notes the first two notes moved by step, and then down by step. Up a skip, 3 notes, down by step. Up a third, down by step. Up a third, down by step. So why is he doing that? How is this different than the beginning part? It's as if we're climbing a mountain, a musical mountain. So the landscape of this next section of the piece is building. Let's play that melody again and listen for it building towards the note E, which happens to be the same thing that he started with. Remember, when he started, our first melody went from E, da da dum. So surrounding that melody at the very end was just really by step. Or from the beginning of the B section. I would propose to you that essentially, you're in this section here, if you're looking at where his goal is, it is to get to that next octave. But much like what we had in the meter section, the section that the A section, we saw varied meters to create a sense of asymmetry. And in this section, Villa-Lobos does the same thing. He gives us a sequence, but the sequence is altered on the way down, so it's not symmetrical. And even where we reach our peak is kind of in the middle. So I would encourage you to think of this whole section not as in 4/4 time, but almost as if it was freer. And to potentially accelerate as you're moving up, definitely to crescendo as you're moving up. There's no dynamic marking on this section. So I would suggest that maybe you start softer. And maybe hover a little bit on that E. As John Dewart used to be fond of saying, the composers, when they create this musical landscape and they give you at the apex of a phrase, take a moment, like you're at the top of a mountain, to enjoy the view. So when you get to the top E, maybe take a little bit of a moment to enjoy that. We're starting soft, and we're going to build to the note E. I'm going to do it all in 7th position. Okay, so my main peak was when I reached the note E, which was in measure 3, and that would have been up here. And then it comes down. Chromatic there. And that lands on the 2nd beat of the 8th measure of the phrase. And then from there, he's going to move up chromatically, and we'll find that, so that you can make the E sharp like a leading tone to the F sharp, and then from there, he starts giving you the same kind of idea, up a third, down a step. Changed it. So what do we have there? We've got a part of a phrase that is really the melodic minor scale. Now he's going to go backwards with the same scheme. scale that comes up from F sharp to B. And then he gives us a chord. In the very end, low B first. And he's got 4 beats there. And then we're back to the opening section, except this time it's marked as moderato, so not quite as slow as the first time. And then we have a repeat of the entire A section, rather than a fragment of. And in that case, it's marked lento again. So in playing this passage, the B middle section, it is the most technically difficult part of the piece, even though I'd say that even the opening part of the piece is difficult to play cleanly and not to get too many squeaks in there, because you're on that lower bass strings. It's pretty easy to make noise. Section. Animato. At this point, the very powerful ending, and now we're back to quiet. 2 notes. B, which is a dominant, of course, for E minor. And then from there, he gives us harmonics. Here you want to make sure that your hand's probably further back so that we're getting nice clear sound on the harmonics. So those are marked mezzo forte. And I think they're marked mezzo forte so that we can hear them. But again, we'd like to see that shape. And now we're back to the beginning, and he didn't mark it as forte, but you notice every note is accented. So I would say even more emphasized than the beginning. In closing, I hope that this little mini class on Prelude number 4 was informative, gave you some new ideas, some thoughts about how to approach this piece, and maybe also a greater appreciation for how the simplicity of an idea, how that Villa-Lobos uses just single tones to be able to capture a very unique and powerful description of a landscape that, for those of us who've never been to the Brazilian forest and have not seen that landscape firsthand, a musical experience of it. And sometimes it's nice to look at a picture, but pictures don't provide you the sounds of the landscape. So using your imagination pictorially and delving into this piece, I think, is a wonderful way to visit Brazilian landscape and also to gain an even greater appreciation for the tremendous genius of Villa-Lobos. There'll be other classes, I hope, for us to discuss some of the other preludes and other pieces that Villa-Lobos wrote. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you have recommendations of other things that you'd like for me to cover, please write them in the comment section. Thank you very much, and happy practicing.